Hello everyone. So in this video I'm going to comment on the Ballymurphy killings. Many people call it the Ballymurphy massacre, and the report that's finally come out. So what happened was in August 1971, the parachute regiment, they shot dead 9 people. There was a 10th person killed, and the judge found that 9 of the 10 killed were shot by this unit of the British Army. The 10th person's not sure. Now, the judge said she was doing this to the civil standard, which is to say, on the balance of probabilities, there is doubt about 2 of those 9. Possibly the Ulster Volunteer Force shot them. The UVF was a loyalist terrorist organization, which was very active at the time, trying to kill any Catholic that they could. So the judge found that all these people were innocent. None was carrying a gun or bomb or had been carrying a gun or bomb at any time. So these were gratuitous killings. It's quite shocking. This 40-something mother, this priest with a white flag as a sort of an emblem of truce, going to the aid of the stricken, and he was shot. There he was lying wounded, and he was shot several more times over a couple of hours. Or sometimes the soldiers grabbed these wounded people, took them off to buildings, didn't provide medical care. So it really was disgraceful. Now, we've got to bear in mind what the situation was in Belfast in 1971. Internment had been introduced days earlier. Internment was detention without trial for terrorist suspects. First of all, it was only used against suspected members of the Irish Republican Army. Later, some suspected members of loyalist terrorist outfits such as the UVF were interned as well. So the British Army was on the streets of Belfast in several thousand strong, and it was a very tense situation. So there were many shootings incidents every single day. Belfast was almost a war zone. Obviously, there were no front lines. The IRA and the UVF they didn't wear uniforms, so it was a fluid and fast-moving situation. So those who speak up for the soldiers would say, well, it was extremely tense. There were bullets flying in all directions, and they panicked, they overreacted, and they fired because they didn't know, they couldn't tell neutral people or civilians from the enemy. So if you fight in very built-up areas, inevitably civilians will get killed. Except, of course, that the honest mistakes will be made. If there's fire coming from that direction and you shoot back in that direction, you might kill the wrong person. You think someone's a gunman holding something. Is that a gun? Depends how far away they are. Some of these people were shot in broad daylight and not very far away. So the claim that soldiers thought someone was carrying a gun are difficult to sustain. If someone was shot in the dark or from very great distance, then the soldier could say it didn't see it properly, thought it was a gun, wasn't a gun, or whatever. Sometimes soldiers would fire in the general direction of where fire is coming for them to scare off the enemies. The enemies get their head down. I don't know if any of these people were killed by ricochets, as in soldiers not actually shooting at that individual, shooting, it hits a wall and bounces and hits the person or whatever. But 10 people shot dead in 10 separate incidents over a weekend. Now, those who advocate for the soldiers would say, well, they were untrained in this sort of situation. Brigadier Frank Kitson wrote the book on this sort of thing, Low Intensity Operations, where there wasn't a declared war, and the casualty figures were not huge. 1971 is about 100 people in Northern Ireland were killed. I know that's bad, but in a real war situation, it would be several thousand. So to try and allow life to go on as normal, I know it was difficult, but people were still going to work, still going to school. There was still electricity and running water and the things you wouldn't expect if that was a battlefield. And the soldiers seem to have met with impunity. I was speaking to an academic about it yesterday, and there seemed to be agreement between the Royal Military Police and the Royal Ulster Constabulary, that was the police at the time, the RUC, not to charge them. So there were rushed investigations. So the investigatory system was collapsing under the sheer volume of cases. So these really perfunctory cases, investigations into the cases, and these reports were written, and barely a cursory glance was given to them by the RUC with a view to prosecuting, but I think they did formally agree that they would not prosecute anyone, so charges were not preferred against anyone. I think some of them should have been indicted. I don't know the particulars of every case, but certainly in some of them there doesn't seem to be any reason for killing this person. I mean, it's hard to believe that these were all honest mistakes. Perhaps none of them were honest mistakes. Because I realize that soldiers are allowed to kill their enemies in wartime. Inevitably, they will commit errors sometimes and kill the wrong person by missing, or by a bullet ricocheting, or shooting someone they think is an enemy combatant but is not. But it's difficult to believe that that's what happened in all these cases. So in terms of homicide, there is justifiable homicide in the case of self-defense. If someone is killing someone believing he's defending himself or defending another person, but it's hard to believe that that was the case, that this is a valid justificatory argument that can be advanced in every single case. So I haven't heard many vindicators of these soldiers come forward. They're from, I think it was the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, the Parachute Regiment being a sort of spearhead unit, and was surely the wrong unit to have in a delicate situation. Belfast was a tinderbox. I realised the conflict had already been going for 2 years at this time, but it was possible to de-escalate it. This was sort of making it worse. And the UK government didn't learn its lesson. I mean, the Parachute Regiment should have been withdrawn immediately. We saw what happened in January 1972 in Derry, or even in the early 90s, clashes with the civilian population somewhere in the Mid-Ulster area. I don't think anyone was actually killed by the Parachute Regiment, but they certainly had a public relations problem with the nationalist community. I mean, I know the British Army in general was unpopular with the nationalist community, but the Parachute Regiment were thought to be the real bad boys. So this self-defense is not one which I think would lie here. So I would have indicted some of them at the time, well, possibly all of them. You've got to see, which obviously wouldn't guarantee that they would be convicted. And some people say that the security forces killed roughly 350 people in the course of that 30-year conflict. That's about 10% of those killed. So if I got that right, murder charges were laid against about 30 of them. I think there were only over 5 convictions for killings that the RUC or the Army carried out in the course of their duties. Some of the RUC or the Ulster Defence Regiment were loyalist terrorists. Very few of them were, but some of them moonlighted as that, and then they were convicted for those crimes, so that's separate. And soldiers were convicted not from the UDR, from the mainstream British Army, in only 3 cases. Clegg, the 2 Scots Guards. There was a Magella O'Hare case where the soldier was found not guilty, and it was quite a shocking crime, shooting dead a 12-year-old girl, and he claimed it was an honest mistake, and he just shrugged it off. And wow. Anyway, so Boris Johnson, he issued a statement. I don't remember quite the exact wording, saying he regretted the events that occurred in Ballymurphy at the time, but many of the relatives of the victims found that insufficient. And I think it was. This was easy to get right. We don't need paraphrastination. David Cameron, for his many flaws, he, I think, showed the way to do it in April 2010, or was it May 2010, days after he became Prime Minister, said, obviously we accept the findings without reservation. I hereby apologise to the families of the victims on behalf of the United Kingdom, and blah, blah, blah. So that ought to have been done to provide closure, to move forward. Because this is half a century ago, tempers have cooled. It's no longer weaponized for the purposes of gaining political ground. So I think Bojo should have given a fulsome and unequivocal apology and said it in person rather than releasing a written statement. He wasn't going to face much pushback from the British Army or politicians who've got sympathies in that direction. So it's quite shocking, obviously. Soldiers are allowed to kill people in combat. I know they're going to make mistakes, but they can't be killing people gratuitously. It seems some of them were shooting willy-nilly and thinking that they could just get away with it. And all right, it would have been difficult and stressful in their situation, but that's the situation they chose to put themselves in. They're all volunteers. They think they're so tough. They think they're not scaredy cats. So if a soldier, even in a combat situation, kills someone, not believing that person to represent any threat, then that is murder. Just because it's a combat situation, it doesn't mean that killing the person is permissible. So believing this person to be a civilian, to be unarmed, not to be doing anything really to aid the enemy, then that is murder. So that's it. I mean, I would have charged some people with murder at the time if I'd had my way. As I say, I don't know the minutiae of each case, but I think a line should be drawn on under these things and no more no more charges should be laid against anyone, whether members of security forces, IRA, UVF, or whoever, and then we can move forward. And then that's a level playing field. Um, Otherwise, I think some people ought to be charged for these crimes because that's justice. Moreover, it would give the nationalist community some confidence in the system. Incidentally, all 10 of those shot dead were Catholic. Ballymurphy's a heavily Catholic area. I mean, almost everywhere there'll be a nationalist of some stripe. Some would actually be Republicans, as in would vote Sinn Féin, would view the IRA as their army, and so forth. So that's my penny's worth on the Ballymurphy massacre, as many call it. Goodbye.